Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back, way back, before streaming services, before mattresses, before, honestly, most things that make life even vaguely tolerable. We're floating down the Nile to the world of ancient Egypt, the land of pyramids, pharaohs, and enough sand to make sure you never want to go to the beach again. Now, you might imagine ancient Egypt as a place of shimmering gold, mysterious rituals, and eyeliner that still looks surprisingly chic in modern fashion. And yes, those things existed. But daily life? Not so glamorous. Not for peasants. Not for nobles. And certainly not for the pharaohs, who, despite their status as literal gods on earth, spent most of their time being sweaty, paranoid, and generally miserable. So, if you've ever thought to yourself, I'd love to live like an Egyptian, let me reassure you, you really, really wouldn't. Let's start with the basics. Food, because even gods on earth needed to eat. And what did the Egyptians eat? Bread and beer. Mostly bread and beer. Sometimes onions. If you were lucky, maybe some dried fish. If you were really lucky, honey. That's it. Imagine waking up every morning, excited for your daily ration. And it's bread. Again. And not the nice fluffy bread from your favorite bakery. This was rough bread, full of grit from the grinding stones. Over time, it wore down people's teeth until their smiles resembled a set of broken pottery. Archaeologists can tell an Egyptian skeleton instantly, just from the ruined molars. The phrase, "smile like an Egyptian," was probably not coined for a reason. And the beer? Not a crisp, golden lager. Think more like a lumpy porridge that had ambitions of being beer, but gave up halfway through. Thick, cloudy, vaguely alcoholic. It was nutritious, yes, and safer than the Nile water, which was a sort of biological soup of crocodiles, parasites, and anything else you didn't want to think about while drinking. But it wasn't exactly refreshing. Now, clothing. Ancient Egypt looks breezy in the art. Everyone in white linen, strolling elegantly with fans and jewelry. Reality check. Linen was scratchy, hot, and difficult to clean. You were basically wrapped in a permanent sauna towel. And yes, cleanliness mattered a lot. Egyptians bathed often, not because they enjoyed it, but because lice, fleas, and general swampy sweat were constant companions. The upper classes shaved their heads bald to avoid lice, then wore wigs made of human hair, sheep's wool, or sometimes plant fibers, which sounds nice, until you remember the Egyptian sun turned wigs into portable ovens. And speaking of the sun, Egypt was hot, blistering, relentless, sand in your eyes hot. There were no sunglasses, no sunscreen, no quiet air-conditioned rooms to retreat into, just relentless exposure. You either baked under the sun, or you stayed indoors where it was dark, smoky, and filled with buzzing insects. Those graceful wall paintings of Egyptians lounging with lotus flowers? They conveniently left out the part where everyone was swatting flies away from their faces every 2 seconds. But let's talk about the work, because the pyramids didn't build themselves, despite what the History Channel might like to suggest about aliens. Most Egyptians were farmers, working long days in the fertile Nile floodplains, planting and harvesting crops with stone tools that would make a modern gardener cry. Farming was backbreaking, literally. Malnutrition, arthritis and heat stroke were just part of the package. And if you weren't farming, you might be conscripted into building monuments. Forget romantic notions of pyramid building as a noble task. It was grueling, hauling massive stone blocks under the sun day after day, while overseers encouraged you with whips. Nothing quite says spiritual achievement like dragging 2-ton limestone blocks until your spine feels like it's trying to exit your body. But maybe you're thinking, but the royals had it good. They had gold, luxury, banquets, palaces. Surely being a pharaoh was the dream. Let's drift into their world for a moment. Imagine being raised as a god. Everyone bows when you enter the room. Your face is on statues. Your name is carved into stone for eternity. And priests tell you you're divine. Sounds nice. Until you realize it also meant every mistake you made was seen as cosmic failure. Did the Nile flood too much? Your fault. Not enough? Also your fault. Did a plague of locusts arrive? Congratulations, you've disappointed both the gods and your subjects. And by the way, your own family is probably plotting to poison you. Sleep well. And then there's inbreeding. Because dynasties love to keep power in the family. Pharaohs married their sisters, cousins, sometimes even their own daughters. The result? Generations of royals with fragile health, odd deformities, and generally unfortunate faces. King Tutankhamun, for instance. He might be famous now for his golden mask, but the boy behind the mask was less impressive. Evidence suggests he had a club foot, cleft palate, malaria, and bone disease. Not exactly the image of a mighty god king. More like a tragic reminder of what happens when your family tree doesn't branch very much. Of course, pharaohs also faced another problem: mummification. Not in life, obviously, but in death. You'd think having your body carefully preserved for eternity would be flattering, but the process was unpleasant. Imagine your organs scooped out, your brain yanked through your nose with a hook, your body packed with resin and linen. The result looked serene enough in a sarcophagus, but the reality was a bit more gruesome. And all of this so future generations could rob your tomb anyway. Ancient Egypt, where not even death gave you peace. But let's drift back to everyday life, because not everyone got to enjoy inbreeding or elaborate embalming. Commoners lived in mud brick houses that melted a little more each year in the rain. They slept on woven reed mats, often with insects crawling across them. Families crammed into 1 or 2 rooms, with smoke from cooking fires stinging their eyes. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort didn't exist. But fleas and sand, those were abundant. Entertainment, too, was simple. Music, beer, board games like Senate, which was essentially a game about navigating the afterlife. Imagine if your favorite pastime was Monopoly, but instead of losing fake money, you symbolically died over and over. Strangely enough, it was popular for centuries. And yet, despite everything, the heat, the grit, the disease, the endless bread and beer, people found meaning. They believed deeply in their gods. They told stories. They painted walls with scenes of farming and fishing, which is probably the most optimistic way of coping with the fact that farming and fishing took up their entire lives. Naturally, not everything was hardship. There were festivals, holidays, and moments of beauty. The Nile's flood brought life as well as misery, And when it rose just right, people celebrated, families gathered, priests paraded sacred statues, and even the poorest peasants could pretend, for a moment, that life was something more than heat and toil. But as you drift into sleep tonight, remember the romantic image of Egypt, the pyramids at sunset, the golden treasures, the serene gods with eyeliner perfect enough for a fashion magazine, was only part of the story. The rest was sweat, grit, and sand between your teeth. And honestly, would you really want to last a day in that world? Because the truth is, you probably wouldn't. Hey everyone, let's leave the blazing Egyptian sun behind and wander quietly into Europe. It's a little cooler here, though not necessarily more comfortable. Because instead of sandstorms and crocodiles, Europe had cold stone castles, drafty halls, and rulers who spent more time marrying their cousins than governing. And that brings us to tonight's gentle theme, royal inbreeding, the peculiar dynastic tradition of keeping power in the family, sometimes quite literally. The result? Generations of monarchs who were less divine and more, well, structurally unsound. Now, if you're feeling a bit smug about your own family drama, let me assure you, nothing you've experienced compares to the genetic soap operas of Europe's royal houses. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, siblings being paired up as if the gene pool were a very small, very shallow pond. Let's drift first into Spain, home of the Habsburgs, a dynasty so committed to marrying within the family that their jawlines became architectural features. Yes, the infamous Habsburg jaw. Imagine a chin so large it could practically cast a shadow of its own. For generations, portraits of Habsburg monarchs show lips struggling to close around teeth, as if even nature had given up trying to make things line up properly. The most famous example, of course, was Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. He was the ultimate product of centuries of genetic recycling. By the time he was born in 1661, his family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. He inherited the Habsburg jaw to such an extreme degree that speaking and eating were lifelong challenges. He also suffered from numerous illnesses, was reportedly unable to walk until age 8, and was considered both mentally and physically unfit to rule. Yet he was king, because of course he was. His reign was marked by political chaos, endless health crises, and desperate attempts by his court to find him an heir. Spoiler alert, there wasn't one. Charles was sterile. His death in 1700 ended the Spanish Habsburg line, triggering the War of Spanish Succession. So in a way, his jaw helped reshape the map of Europe. But Spain wasn't alone. Let's drift over to Austria. The Habsburgs there were just as determined to keep the bloodline pure, or, more accurately, stagnant. Marriages between close relatives were routine. One particularly striking case was Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. By the time he took the throne in the 16th century, he suffered from epilepsy, depression, and a tendency to mumble incoherently. His advisors essentially ruled for him, while Ferdinand himself spent much of his reign drooling, which, to be fair, may have been the least harmful thing a monarch could do. Now, let's glide over to France. The French royal family wasn't immune to the charms of cousin marriage either. But their dynasties also reveal another strange quirk, the obsession with producing heirs at any cost. Take Louis XIV, the Sun King. He himself was reasonably healthy, but his descendants, not so much. Years of intermarriage meant that infant mortality was practically a family tradition. Out of his many legitimate grandchildren, very few survived to adulthood. Smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, all found easy victims in the fragile, inbred royal nurseries. But perhaps the most tragicomic example lies in the Bourbon dynasty of Spain. Remember Philip V, who inherited the throne after the childless Charles II? Philip was French, but married into the same tangle of relatives. His descendants carried on the genetic tradition with enthusiasm. Fast forward a century, and you find Ferdinand VII of Spain, a king so unpleasant, so petty, and so unpopular that even his own subjects seemed embarrassed by him. He married multiple times, each time to a cousin or close relative, and spent much of his reign undoing constitutional reforms. His fragile health and equally fragile personality helped pave the way for Spain's 19th century instability. But Europe's royal inbreeding wasn't just Spanish or French. Let's drift north to the Habsburg-related courts of Central Europe, then quietly over to Britain, where the story takes on another twist: hemophilia. Ah yes, hemophilia, the royal disease. A genetic blood disorder where even minor injuries could lead to uncontrolled bleeding. It spread through Europe thanks to Queen Victoria of Britain, who carried the gene. She passed it on to her many children, who then married into almost every royal family on the continent. The result? A web of fragile heirs across Spain, Germany, and Russia. The most famous case was Alexei Romanov, the heir to the Russian throne. Born in 1904, he inherited hemophilia from his mother, Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. His condition was so severe that a small bruise could become life-threatening. The constant fear surrounding his health led his parents into the desperate arms of a certain mystical advisor named Rasputin. You might recall him, the bearded man who looked like he hadn't slept in several decades. His supposed ability to ease Alexei's pain gave him enormous influence over the royal family, with disastrous political consequences. So, thanks to cousin marriage and genetic luck, Europe not only got fragile heirs, it also got Rasputin. Quite a bargain. Now, it's worth noting that royals weren't inbreeding because they were lazy or unimaginative. Well, not only because of that, it was largely about politics. Marrying outside the dynasty was risky. It meant alliances with outsiders, claims to power slipping away. By keeping marriages inside the family, dynasties believed they were protecting their thrones. Ironically, they were often weakening them. A family tree with too many loops doesn't produce strong branches. Of course, not all inbred monarchs were weak. Some were surprisingly competent. For example, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, another Habsburg with a serious jawline, still managed to rule a vast empire on which the sun never set. Though, to be fair, he spent much of his reign sick, stressed, and trying to keep track of rebellions. His health declined so badly that he retired early to a monastery, where he spent his final years plagued by gout and melancholia. Because nothing says relaxing retirement like constant pain and regret. And then there's Leopold I of Austria, another heavily inbred monarch. He wasn't exactly a picture of charisma, described as short, unattractive, and pious to the point of obsession. Yet he reigned for nearly 50 years, enduring wars with the Ottomans and the French. Sometimes, even a tangle of genetics couldn't keep a dynasty from stumbling along. Still, the pattern is clear. Inbreeding made Europe's monarchs fragile, odd-looking, and often tragically short-lived. Their portraits tell the story almost as clearly as their medical records. Narrow chins, protruding jaws, drooping eyes. A gallery of features that remind us nature prefers variety, not recycling. So, the next time you look at your own family tree and cringe at an awkward reunion or a weird uncle, just be grateful the branches actually spread outward. Because for centuries, Europe's royals chose to loop back in on themselves, and the result was a legacy of fragile bodies, troubled reigns, and dynasties that often collapsed under the weight of their own genetics. Let's drift gently away from their palaces now. The candles burn low, the tapestries sway in the draft, and somewhere in a gilded nursery, a fragile royal child coughs softly. The illusion of divine rule hides a very human truth. Power can make you rich, but it can't make you healthy. And with that, let's float onward to the next royal fiasco. Hey everyone, we've wandered through frozen peasant huts and the jawlines of the Habsburgs. Now, let's drift a little deeper into the candlelit world of royal marriages. The thing about royals is that marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances, territory, and occasionally the faint hope of producing an heir who could string a sentence together without collapsing, which meant that many royal unions were less romantic fairy tales and more carefully negotiated disasters. Picture this. A young princess, maybe 12 years old, bundled onto a horse or a boat, shipped hundreds of miles away, and married off to a man she'd never met. Sometimes he was her cousin. Sometimes he was her uncle. Occasionally, he was her brother. Naturally, these unions didn't always produce healthy results. Let's begin with one of the great cautionary tales. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad, which, to be fair, might be an exaggeration, but her marriage certainly didn't help her mental health. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the same pair who financed Columbus. In 1496, she married Philip the Handsome, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. Handsome he may have been, but charming he was not. Their marriage was passionate, yes, but it quickly descended into jealousy, paranoia, and manipulation. Philip was unfaithful, which enraged Joanna. Her fits of anger and despair were interpreted by her court as signs of madness. After Philip's early death, he was only 28. Joanna's grief tipped into obsession. She reportedly refused to part with his body, traveling with his coffin and opening it to gaze at him. Historians debate how much of this was true and how much was exaggerated by those who wanted her sidelined. But the label stuck. La Loca. Joanna spent the rest of her long life locked away, while her son Charles became emperor. Her tragic marriage had not only destroyed her reputation, it had handed power to the next generation. From Spain, let's float north to England, specifically the Tudors. Because when it comes to royal marital disasters, the Tudors never disappoint. Henry VIII, of course, is the obvious candidate. 6 wives, 2 executed, 1 annulled, 1 died in childbirth, 1 divorced, and 1 outlived him. His desperate quest for a male heir tore England out of the Catholic Church and left Europe blinking in confusion. The irony? His son Edward VI died young, leaving the throne to his daughters. So all the chaos accomplished very little. But Henry's marriages also carried genetic consequences. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, gave him Elizabeth, one of England's greatest monarchs. Yet Anne herself met the executioner's block. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally delivered a male heir, Edward, but she died shortly after childbirth. Edward, meanwhile, was frail, sickly, and died at 15. Historians now suspect Henry's obsession with producing a son may have been complicated by a genetic disorder. Some argue he had McLeod syndrome, a rare condition that can cause infertility, miscarriages, and madness, which would explain the string of failed pregnancies and Henry's increasingly paranoid, tyrannical behavior. A genetic ghost haunting an entire dynasty. Let's not forget his daughter Mary I, Bloody Mary. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was deeply unpopular in England. Worse, Mary endured multiple phantom pregnancies, where her body swelled as if she were carrying a child, only for nothing to appear, likely a result of uterine cancer. The personal tragedy left England without an heir and only deepened her reputation as a failed queen. Now, across the channel, we find another marital catastrophe, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Their union was meant to cement an alliance between France and Austria. Instead, it became a symbol of decadence and incompetence. At the beginning, the problem was intimate, or rather, the lack of intimacy. Louis reportedly suffered from phimosis, a medical condition that made intercourse painful. For the first 7 years of their marriage, the royal couple produced no heir. This, naturally, became the subject of endless gossip. It wasn't until Louis finally underwent a minor surgical procedure that things improved. By then, the damage was done. Marie Antoinette had already gained a reputation for frivolity, and their eventual children couldn't erase the whispers of dysfunction. As history marched on, that marriage ended, quite literally, at the guillotine. Proof that sometimes a bad match can bring down more than just a household. Let's drift over to Russia now, where dynastic marriages created their own brand of chaos. Take Peter III and Catherine the Great. Peter was heir to the Russian throne, a man described as childish, unstable, and more interested in playing with toy soldiers than ruling. His arranged marriage to Catherine of Anhalt-Zerbst was miserable from the start. Peter was erratic and neglectful, while Catherine was ambitious and clever. She eventually orchestrated a coup, had him overthrown, and ruled Russia herself. Catherine the Great. Peter, meanwhile, died shortly after his abdication. Whether by accident or assassination remains unclear. Either way, it was one of history's more effective divorces. And then there's the infamous marriage of Nicholas II and Alexandra, the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. Their love was genuine, unusually so for royals. But their union carried the hemophilia gene into the Russian imperial line. Their only son, Alexei, inherited it. His illness consumed the family, leading Alexandra into the influence of Rasputin. A marriage born of affection, but twisted into tragedy by genetics and misplaced trust. Now, not all royal marriages were disasters on such a scale, but many were quietly miserable. Princess Caroline of Brunswick, for example, married the future George IV of Britain. On meeting her for the first time, George declared himself repulsed. He even demanded brandy to get through the wedding night. Their relationship never improved. He took mistresses. She lived abroad. And when he became king, He tried to bar her from the coronation. Their marriage was less a union and more a prolonged insult. And sometimes, it wasn't just one bad marriage, but a whole dynasty of them. The Habsburgs, again, make a strong case. Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, was married twice. Neither union produced children, not surprising, given his condition. His wives, Maria Anna of Neuburg and Marie Louise of Orleans, were both blamed for the lack of heirs, as if they could have magically fixed centuries of inbreeding with sheer determination. Royal women, after all, bore the brunt of these failed unions. If a marriage was childless, the wife was blamed. If the child was sickly, the wife was blamed. If the husband was cruel or incompetent, somehow, still, the wife was blamed. A cycle of dynastic scapegoating that filled palaces with quiet misery. And yet, these marriages shaped history. Treaties were signed, wars were fought, dynasties rose and fell, all because two people were forced to stand at an altar and smile through their teeth. So, as you lie there tonight, drifting deeper into the soft quiet, remember that behind the portraits and titles, these royals lived out some of the most uncomfortable domestic arrangements imaginable. Their crowns glittered, yes, but their marriages often resembled cages. Let's float now, gently, toward another corner of history, the royal nurseries. Places filled not with joy, but with fragile infants, endless funerals, and the faint smell of despair. Because next, we'll drift into the sad, sickly world of royal childhoods. Hey everyone, you've settled in. The lights are low, and the night stretches out quietly ahead. We've drifted through cold peasant huts and broken royal marriages. Now, let's wander softly into the nursery. Not your ordinary nursery, with stuffed animals and bedtime stories. No, this is a royal nursery, which means it's filled with gilt cradles, nervous nurses, and the constant, unspoken fear that the child inside might not live long enough to see adulthood. Because if there's one thing medieval royals were particularly bad at, it was producing healthy children. Between inbreeding, poor hygiene, and medical advice that could best be described as creative guesswork, childhood at court was often a grim affair. Let's begin with a figure you know, Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. His birth was celebrated as the long-awaited male heir, the boy who would carry the Tudor dynasty forward. Except he was sickly from the start. Edward coughed, wheezed, and wasted away in his teens. He became king at 9, but he never really had the strength to rule. Regents made decisions for him while he tried, valiantly, to play the role of monarch. By 15, he was dead, likely from tuberculosis, though some whisper of other illnesses. Henry VIII had fought, married, and executed for this heir, only to have him vanish like a candle flame in a draft. Now, Edward wasn't unusual. The truth is, royal children died at alarming rates. Infant mortality was common in the Middle Ages for everyone, but even palaces weren't immune. In fact, being royal sometimes made it worse. Physicians applied leeches, purges, and prayers. Midwives whispered superstitions, and the bloodlines themselves, already stretched thin by generations of cousin marriages, didn't provide much resilience. Take Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles, born the final Habsburg ruler of Spain. He was the product of generations of inbreeding. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were, quite literally, the same people. The result was a child so frail that he was not expected to live beyond infancy. Yet he did, unfortunately. Charles couldn't walk until he was 8. He didn't speak until he was 4. His jaw jutted forward so far he couldn't chew food properly. His body was weak, his mind clouded, and his court spent decades trying to prop him up as a functioning monarch. He lived into his 30s, but left no heirs, and Spain's dynasty collapsed with him. The sad irony? Every fragile moment of his childhood was seen as precious, because he was the hope of the nation, a hope built on a frail body that could barely carry the weight of its crown. If Charles was a warning sign of inbreeding gone too far, then the children of France provided examples of indulgence gone sideways. Royal French nurseries were gilded cages, where princes and princesses were treated as living symbols rather than human children. Take Louis XIV, the Sun King. He survived childhood, which was in itself remarkable. But he grew up spoiled, surrounded by servants who anticipated his every whim. By adulthood, he was convinced that his will was divine. He built Versailles, bankrupted his nobles, and left France teetering on ruin. One might say his childhood had instilled in him not resilience, but entitlement. Other children weren't so lucky. Henry VI of England, for instance, became king at just 9 months old. Imagine that, a baby technically ruling a kingdom. Of course, regents actually ran things, but Henry grew up under the crushing expectation that he must become a warrior king like his father, Henry V. Instead, he was timid, bookish, and prone to mental breakdowns. By adulthood, he drifted between lucidity and catatonia, sometimes unable to speak for months. The Wars of the Roses raged around him while he sat quietly, unable to cope. His childhood had not prepared him for the brutality of kingship, and his reign crumbled accordingly. And then we have the strange case of Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. His childhood was a nightmare. Orphaned young, he was left in the care of ambitious boyars who neglected and abused him. Ivan grew up in fear, bitterness festering inside him. As a child, he was said to have tortured animals for amusement. By adulthood, that cruelty expanded to humans. He ruled through paranoia and violence, lashing out with a ferocity that turned him into a cautionary tale. His childhood, steeped in trauma, shaped one of the most terrifying rulers in history. Let's pause here to reflect. Royal children were often presented as angels in portraits, chubby cheeks, golden curls, miniature crowns. But behind those canvases were sickbeds, isolation, and sometimes outright abuse. Childhood wasn't innocent. It was political. Every cough, every stumble, every fainting spell became a matter of state. A dying child could plunge kingdoms into crisis. Consider the heirs of France once again. The dauphins, as they were called, were often mourned more than celebrated. Louis XV, for instance, only became king because nearly everyone ahead of him in the line of succession died young. His parents, grandparents, and older siblings all succumbed to disease within a few short years. The survival of a single child shifted the entire course of a nation. Sometimes, royal children weren't even treated as individuals. They were bargaining chips, betrothed at birth, shipped off to foreign courts. Their childhoods ended before they began. Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent to France at just 5 years old to be raised as a future bride for the Dauphin. She grew up in luxury, yes, but also in isolation, constantly aware she was a pawn in the game of dynasties. Even when children lived, they often carried the scars of their upbringing into adulthood. George III of Britain, for example, grew up under strict discipline taught that kings must embody morality. He later became known for his bouts of madness, now thought to be either porphyria or bipolar disorder. The pressures of his upbringing, combined with the genetic lottery, left him unraveling in front of his kingdom. And then there are the forgotten children, the ones who didn't live long enough to be remembered in grandeur. Tiny coffins filled the vaults of Europe's cathedrals. In Spain, out of 24 children born to Isabella and Ferdinand, only 5 survived to adulthood. In Austria, Empress Maria Theresa gave birth to 16 children. 7 died before adulthood. These losses were devastating personally, but also politically. Every death meant a treaty disrupted, a succession endangered. It's easy to forget, when we hear prince or princess, that most of these children didn't live long or didn't live well. They were symbols first, humans second. Their bodies carried the hopes of nations, and their childhoods were anything but carefree. So as you lie in your bed tonight, breathing softly, imagine those royal nurseries, candlelight flickering on painted walls, servants whispering, doctors fumbling with leeches and herbs, a child coughing in the night, while the future of an empire trembles with each shallow breath. The irony, of course, is that while peasants outside the castle walls froze and starved, the royal children inside were often just as fragile. Wealth couldn't protect them from genetics, or disease, or the crushing expectations of their families. And yet, these fragile, spoiled, or sorrowful children grew up, when they did survive, to rule kingdoms, declare wars, and rewrite history. The echoes of their sickbeds reached far beyond the nursery. Let's drift, now, toward another corner of history's dimly lit room. We've seen the children. Next, we'll wander into the world of petty kings and queens, the monarchs whose personal grudges, vanity, and dysfunction turned entire courts into soap operas. Because nothing says bedtime history quite like a royal tantrum dressed in ermine.